Alright, I'm ready for lore. Are you guys ready for lore? It's lore time. Okay. So, we're doing this a little freeform. Lore, L-O-R-E. Alright, since this is my first time doing lore on stream. Here, let's do it this way. Okay, don't worry. Don't worry. It's okay. It's okay. There, I'll even leave the printer up for you guys. Look. Mommy cares. The printer is still running. Alright. So. Yeah, first time. Where should we start? Should we start at the beginning of the of everything, or should I do like a certain faction's lore or a certain character's lore? I think since this is our first time, we should start at the beginning and do like a zoomed out timeline of history. Yeah, what do you guys think? Like way out. Like start with shit like who is the Emperor of Mankind? Who are the Eldari? What are the Tyranids? Things like that. What is the Horus Heresy? And why is it important to Warhammer's lore? Slaanesh? We'll get to the birth of Slaanesh. Alright. We need like some eerie like sci-fi music. We need some mood music, guys. There we go. I found it. Oh yeah, there we go. That's the good shit. Is that too loud, or is it good? It sounds good to me. How about now? Yeah? Are we good here? I need some input. Alright. Perfect. We'll find out, I suppose. No, I think it's just ambience. It's just ambience. It should stay pretty mellow the whole time. It should sound like a dull hum. I guess we'll start at the beginning. Since this is our first adventure into the history of Warhammer 40k's lore, we're gonna start from the beginning. First, let's have an overview of how the Imperium tracks time. So we can set the stage. Within the Imperium, there is a concept known as the Chronostrife. The Chronostrife is a bitter, ongoing conflict within the Inquisition's Order Chronos over the Imperium of Man's standard dating system. It occurred during the Era Indomitus, some time after the resurrection of Rabute Guilliman in the 13th Black Crusade. Rabute Guilliman is now the Lord Commander of the Imperium, Imperial Regent, and Primarch of the Ultramarines. The Order Chronos was intent on making a full and accurate accounting of the Imperium's fragmentary and often contradictory history, the truth of which would inevitably help humanity's advancement out of the darkness that had befallen in the millennia since the Horus Heresy, 10,000 years ago. Guilliman created a small imperial organization known as the Logos Historica Verita, formed from individuals of an inquisitive and liberal nature. After training them personally in objective methods of data collection, the Primarch assigned them the daunting task of discovering, collating, and cataloging thousands of years of human history, and that had been lost or was woefully inaccurate due to superstition, suppression, or purposeful obfuscation by the High Lords of Terra. But the monumental task Guilliman had set before them was made all the more daunting when the Primarch discovered that even the Emperor's calendar had not survived the millennia intact. During the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, the standard imperial dating system had provided some idea of the order of events over time, but like everything else the Emperor had created, the calendar had become degraded by both dogmatic adherence and thoughtless revisionism. Various rival dating systems had evolved from the imperial standard, making a true chronicle of the human-settled galaxy almost impossible to construct. As the first phase of the Indomitus Crusade drew to a close sometime around what had originally been believed to be the 12th year of the 42nd millennium, Guilliman calculated that the current year by 5 main factorial variants of the imperial calendar to be anywhere between the early 41st millennium AD and an entire millennium later, that was leaving out the numerous lesser and more heretical interpretations. Guilliman had been hoping to find a solution to the Imperium's tortured dating system. He had instead found there was none. It was something else that would ultimately require his personal attention to repair. As a result, all dates mentioned following in the millennia after the Horus Heresy should be considered only approximations, and for many, the 41st millennium has not yet come to a close. We'll start with pre-human history, with the birth of the Star Gods. The birth of the entities later known as the Star Gods occurred at the same time as the moment of creation itself, as they formed the vast, insensate energies first unleashed by that churning mass of cataclysmic force in that anarchic interweaving of matter and energy. The sea of stars began to swirl into existence, and for an eon, the universe was nothing more than hot hydrogen gas and light an elemental dust ruled over by the gravitic force of billions of newborn suns. Long before the first planets had formed and cooled, the very first truly self-aware beings emerged into the universe. Their thoughts encased within the lines of force produced by the plasma and electromagnetic flares of the stars themselves. In later times, these entities would become known as the Catan, but early in their existence, they were nothing like the malevolent beings they would eventually become. They were little more than monstrous energy parasites that suckled upon the solar energies of the stars that had brought them into existence, shortening the lives of otherwise main-sequence stars by millions of standard years. In time, these star vampires learned to move along the lines of the universe's electromagnetic flux, leaving their birthplaces to drift through the cosmic ether to new stellar feeding grounds, and began their cycle of stellar destruction once more. Beings of pure energy, they paid no mind to the hunks of solid matter they passed in the vacuum of space. The blazing geothermal fires and weak geomagnetic fields of these nascent planets, insufficient to be worth feeding even their ravenous hunger. Just as the stars gave birth to their children, so the planets of the newborn Milky Way galaxy eventually gave birth to life forms composed of matter, which began the long evolutionary climb to self-awareness. The first intelligent beings known to have developed a civilization, technologically advanced enough to cross the stars, was a reptilian species of beings that would later be called the Old Ones by the Eldari, who knew them best of all their creations. The Old Ones possessed a slow, cold-blooded but still deep wisdom. Having long studied the stars and raised astronomy and physics to such a level that their science and technology appeared now to humanity like an arcane art, their understanding of the workings of the universe were such that they could manipulate alternate dimensions and undertake great works of psychic engineering. The Old Ones were potent psychers who routinely used the warp for a wide variety of technological applications. This included the construction of a system of instantaneous, faster-than-light portals through warp space. These portals connected all of the Old Ones' colony worlds, allowing them to cross the vast gulfs of space with only a single step through the myriad warp gates. They built these to connect the worlds of the galaxy. This was a vast, interdimensional network much like the webway of today, which its direct descendant, though on a much larger scale and much more advanced. Through this network, the Old Ones spread their spawn to many places in the galaxy, but they also knew that life was precious. Where they passed, they seeded new intelligent species and reshaped thousands of worlds to make them according to their predetermined environmental and geographic criteria. It is believed by some in the Adeptus Mechanicus that even Terra felt the Old One's touch long before humanity's rise to self-awareness. Though this notion is considered heretical, but at best by the ecclesiarchy, as the imperial creed teaches that mankind was made in the image of the God Emperor before his spirit was incarnated in physical flesh millennia ago. The Old One civilization reached its height in excess of 60 million standard years ago. The Old Ones were responsible for the creation or genetic advancement of most of the currently active intelligent species of the galaxy, including the Eldari, the Quark, the Slan, and the Jokero, though it is unknown if they played any direct role in the evolution of humanity. The humanoid species that would become the Necrons began their existence under a fearsome, scourging star in the far reaches of the galaxy known as the Halo Stars region, billions of standard years before humanity evolved on Terra. Assailed at every moment by solar winds and intense radiation storms, the flesh and blood species known as the Necrontyr became a morbid people, whose precarious lifespans were riven by constant loss. What little information the Imperium has recovered on the Necrontyr tells that their lives were once short and uncertain. Their bodies blighted and consumed at an early age by terrible cancers and other illnesses linked to the high levels of ionizing radiation given off by their sun. Necrontyr cities were built in anticipation of their inhabitants' early demise, as the living were only brief residents, scratching their daily livelihoods in the shadow of the vast sepulchres and tombs of their ancestors. Likewise, their ruling dynasties were founded on the anticipation of an early death, and the living were thought of as no more than temporary residents hurrying through the more permanent and lasting structures raised to honor the dead. On the Necrontyr homeworld, the greatest monuments were always built for the dead, never for the living. Driven by necessity, the Necrontyr escaped their crucible prison and stuck out for the stars, hopeful of carving an empire in which they could realize their species' freedom from the lethal energies of their birth star. Using stasis crypts and slow-moving antimatter-powered torch ships that were clad in living metal known as necrodermis, to resist the millennia-long journeys through the void, the Necrontyr began to colonize distant worlds. Little by little, the Necrontyr dynasty spread even further, until much of the ancient galaxy answered to their rule. From the earliest days, the rulers of individual Necrontyr dynasties were themselves governed by the Triarch, a council composed of 3 Necron dynasty monarchs known as Pharaons. The head of the Triarch was known as the Silent King, for he addressed his subjects only through the other 2 Pharaons who ruled alongside him. Nominally a hereditary position, the uncertain lifespans of Necrontyr ensured that the title of Silent King nonetheless passed from one royal dynasty to another many times. The final days of the Necrontyr Empire occurred in the reign of Zarek, the last of the Silent Kings. Sometime during their slow interstellar expansion, the Necrontyr encountered an ancient species far older than any other in existence in the known galaxy. These beings were the Old Ones, and they were absolute masters of forms of energy the Necrontyr could not even conceive of, yet alone wield. The Old Ones had long ago conquered the secrets of immortality, yet they refused to share the gift of eternal life with the Necrontyr, who yet bore the genetic curse of the bitter star they had been born under. The colonization of much of the galaxy by the reptilian mystics had been immeasurably swifter and more expansive than that of the Necrontyr because of their warp gates and master of the immaterium. That and the Old Ones' incredibly long, if not downright immortal lifespans, kindled a burning, jealous rage in the Necrontyr, which ate at their culture spiritually, as much as physical cancers consumed their bodies. The Necrontyr were astonished to learn that another intelligent species enjoyed such long lives, while their own were cut so brutally short. As time wore on, further strife came to the Necrontyr. Each dynasty sought to claim its own destiny, and soon the great houses were engaged in all-out conflicts known as the Wars of Succession. Had circumstances remained as they were for but a generation more, it is possible that the Necrontyr would have wiped themselves out, as so many species had before them and shall do again in the future. As their territory grew ever wider and more diverse, the unity that had made them strong was eroded, and bitter wars were waged as entire realms fought to win independence. Ultimately, the Triarch realized that the only hope of unity for their people lay in conflict with an external enemy. But there were few who could prove a credible threat to the technologically advanced Necrontyr. Only the Old Ones were a prospective foe, powerful enough to bind the feuding Necrontyr dynasties to a common cause. Such a war was simplicity itself to justify, for the Necrontyr had ever rankled at the Old Ones' refusal to share the secrets of eternal life. So it was that Zarek, the last of the Silent Kings, in a typically bitter act of jealousy and resentment for the Necrontyr race, declared war on the Old Ones. At the same time, he offered amnesty to any cessationist Necrontyr dynasties who were willing to return to the fold of the Triarch. Thus, lured by the spoils of victory and the promise of immortality, the separatist Necrontyr realms abandoned their wars of secession, and what was later known as the War in Heaven began. A conflict unlike any fought before erupted across the stars. Yet, while the Silent King and the Triarch had succeeded in uniting their hateful people, it was a war the Necrontyr could not win. Not on their own. The terrible wars between the Old Ones and the Necrontyr followed later, in Eldari myth as the War in Heaven, would fill a library in their own right, but the Necrontyr could never win. Their superior technology was constantly outmaneuvered by the Old Ones thanks to their mastery of the webway portals and warp gates. The Necrontyr were pushed back until they were little more than an irritation to the Old Ones' dominance. A quiescent threat, clinging to their irradiated world among the halo stars, exiled and forgotten. The Necrontyr's fury was cooled by their long millennia of imprisonment on their held world, slowly transforming into an utter hatred towards all other forms of intelligent life, and an implacable implacable determination to avenge themselves upon their seemingly invincible enemies. But, in the face of defeat, the always fragile unity of the Necrontyr began to fracture once more. No longer did the prospect of a common enemy have any hold over the disparate dynasties. Scores of generations had now lived and died in service of an unwinnable war, and many Necrontyr dynasties would have gladly sued for peace with the Old Ones if the ruling Triarch had permitted it. Thus began the second iteration of the Wars of Secession. More widespread and ruinous than they had come before. So fractured had the Necrontyr dynasties become that, by then, had the Old Ones been so inclined, they could have wiped out their foe with ease. Faced with total collapse of their rule, the Triarch searched desperately for a means of restoring order. In this, their prayers were answered, though the price for their species would be incalculably high. It was during the reign of Silent King Zarek that the godlike energy of beings known as the Catan first blighted the Necrontyr. It is impossible to say for certain how the Necrontyr first made contact with the Catan, though many misleading, contradictory, and one-sided accounts of these events exist. The dusty archives of the tomb world of Solemnus claimed it was but an accident, a chance discovery made by a stellar probe during the investigation of a dying star. The Book of the Mournful Night, held under close guard in the Eldari Black Library's innermost sanctum, tells rather that the raw hatred of the Necrontyr, held as a species for the Old Ones, sang out across space, acting as a beacon that the Catan could not ignore. Another account claims that from the earliest days of their civilization, Necrontyr scientists had deeply engaged in stellar studies to try and understand and protect themselves from their own sun's baleful energies. After long, bitter centuries of searching for some power to unleash upon the Old Ones, the Necrontyr researchers used stellar probes to discover unusual electrodynamic anomalies in the oldest, dying stars of the galaxy. In the complex skeins of the energetic plasma of these suns, the Necrontyr found an intelligence that was more ancient than that of any of the corporeal species in creation, including the Old Ones. Entities of pure energy that had spawned during the birth of the stars, eons before. These entities had little conception of what the rest of the universe entailed when the Necrontyr first found them. Feeding upon the solar flares and magnetic storms of these bloated red giants, here was the weapon of the Necrontyr had long sought to bring about the downfall of the Old Ones. Beings they believed were the progeny of the death god they had long worshipped. Howsoever first contact occurred, the shadow of the Catan fell over the oldest Necrontyr dynasties first. The power of these starborn creatures was incredible. The raw energy of the stars made animate, and the Necrontyr called them the Catan, or star gods, in their own tongue. The Catan were dispersed across areas larger than whole planets. Their consciousnesses too vast for humanoids to comprehend. How the Necrontyr ever managed to communicate with them is unknown to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Understanding that such diffuse minds could never perceive the material universe without manifesting themselves in a material form, some Necrontyr actively sought the Catan's favor and oversaw the forging of physical shells for the Catan to occupy, cast from living metal called necrodermis that they had once used for their colony torch ships. Fragmentary Eldari legends tell of translucent streamers of electromagnetic force shifting across space as the star vampires coiled into their new bodies. The physical realms across an incorporeal bridge of starlight. Thus clad, the Catan took the physical shape of the Necrontyr's half-forgotten gods, hiding their own true desires beneath cloaks of obsequious subservience. Incomprehensible forces were compressed into the living metal of the necrodermis bodies which the Necrontyr had forged, as the full power of the Catan at last found form. As the Catan focused their consciousnesses and became ever more aware of their new mode of existence, they came to appreciate the pleasures available to beings of matter and other realities of corporeal life. The deliciously focused trickles of electromagnetic energy given off by the physical bodies of the Necrontyr all about them awakened a new hunger in the Catan, very unlike the one they had once sated using the nourishing but essentially tasteless energies of the stars. So it was that one of the Catan came before the Silent King, acting as forerunner to the coming of his brothers. Amongst his own kind, this Catan was known as Mephetron, the Deceiver, for he was willfully treacherous. Yet the Silent King did not know this Catan's true nature, instead granted the creature an audience. The Deceiver spoke of a war, fought long before the birth of the Necrontyr between the Catan and the Old Ones. It was a war, he said, that the Catan had lost. In the aftermath, and fearing the vengeance of the Old Ones, he and his brothers had hidden themselves away, hoping one day to find allies with whom they could finally bring the Old Ones to account. In return for this aid, the Deceiver assured he and his brothers would deliver everything that the Necrontyr craved. Unity could be theirs once again, and the immortality they had sought for so long would finally be within their grasp. No price would there be for these great gifts, the deceiver insisted, for they were but boons to be bestowed upon valued allies. Thus did the deceiver speak, and who can say how much of this tale is true? It is doubtful whether even the deceiver knew, for trickery had become so much a part of his existence that even the Catan could no longer define its root. Yet his words held sway over Zarek, who, like his ancestors before him, despaired of the divisions that were once again tearing his people apart. For long solar months, he debated the matter with the other two pharaohs of the Triarch and the nobles of his royal court. Through it all, the only dissenting voice was that of Orican, the court astrologer of the Triarch, who foretold that the alliance between the Necrontyr and the Catan would bring about a renaissance of glory, but would forever destroy the soul of the Necrontyr people. Yet desire and ambition swiftly overrode caution, and Orican's prophecy was dismissed. A Necrontyr year after the Deceiver had presented his proposition, the Triarch agreed to the alliance, and so forever doomed their species. For their part, the Necrontyr soon fell into awe of their discoveries, and the Catan moved to take control over their benefactors. The powers of the Catan manifested in the physical world were indeed almost godlike, and it was not long before the Catan were being worshipped as the star gods the Necrontyr had named them. Perhaps they had been tainted by the material universe they had become a part of, or perhaps this had always been their nature, even when they were bound to the suns they fed upon. But the Catan proved to be as cruel and capricious as the stars from which they had been born. Soon they reveled in the religious worship of the Necrontyr, and feasted upon the electromagnetic life energies of countless mortal slaves. When the Silent King saw what had been done, he knew at last the true nature of the Catan, and of the doom they had wrought in his name. An excerpt from the Book of Mournful Night. Armed with the weapons of godlike power and starships that could cross the galaxy in the blink of an eye through the use of quantum phase technology, the Necrontyrs stood ready to begin their war against the Old Ones anew, but the Catan had another gift for their mortal subjects. They offered the Necrontyr a path to immortality, and the physical stability their species had always craved. Their diseased flesh would be replaced with living metal of necrodermis that made up their star gods' own physical forms. Their discarded husks would be consumed, and their cold metal forms would then be freed to pursue their great vengeance against the Old Ones and the rest of the hateful universe, freed forever from the weakness of their hated flesh. With the pact between the Necrontyr and the Catan sealed, the star gods reveled in the form that immortality would take for the Necrontyr, and the great biotransference process began. Vast biofoundries were constructed, and into these the Silent King's peoples marched according to the terms of the pact he had made with the Catan. What blasphemous procedures the Necrontyr were subjected to within these raging biofurnaces cannot be known. But, certainly, each was stripped of flesh and soul, their body replaced by a shell of living metal necrodermis, much like the Catan themselves, animated by what remained of their guttering self. Above each furnace swooped and dove the ethereal true forms of the Catan as they glutted themselves on the spiritual and electromagnetic detritus of an entire species. It was only when the Silent King himself emerged from the biotransference process and looked upon what had become of his people that he saw the awful truth of the pact he had made. Though immortality and nigh godlike strength and vigor were his, it had come at the cost of his soul, the etheric remains of which had already been sucked down the gullet of a circling Catan. As Zarek watched the Catan feast on the life essence of his people, he realized the terrible depth of his mistake. In many ways, he felt better than he had in Necrontyr decades. The countless aches and uncertainties of organic life were now behind him. His new machine body was far mightier than the frail form he had tolerated for so long. And his thoughts were swifter and clearer than they had ever been. Yet there was a terrible emptiness gnawing at his mind, an inexpressible hollowness of spirit that defied rational explanation. In that moment he knew with cold certainty that the price of physical immortality had been the loss of his soul. With great sorrow the Silent King beheld the fate he had brought upon his people. The Necrontyr were now but a memory, and the soulless, undying Necrons had been reborn in their place. Yet, if the price had been steep, biotransference had fulfilled all of the promises that the Catan had made. Even the lowliest of the Necrontyr was now blessed with immortality. Age and hard ionizing radiation could little erode their new mechanical bodies, and only the most terrible of injuries could destroy them utterly. The biotransference process had embedded engrammatic command protocols in every Necron mind, granting Zarek the unswerving loyalty of his subjects. At first, the Silent King embraced this unanimity, for it was welcome. The reprieve from the chaos and fractitiousness that had consumed the Necrontyr Empire in recent years. The entire species was now to his command, and so it fell upon the Necrons to honor their side of the terrible bargain. However, as time wore on, Zarek grew weary of his burden, but dared not sever the command protocols, lest his subjects turn on him, seeking vengeance for his terrible curse. A curse that he visited on them. Biotransference left behind only the ghostly echoes of the Necrontyr's consciousnesses. Only a few of the most strong-willed Necrontyr among the nobility and military retained their intellect and self-awareness, and even they were but shadows of their former selves. They had been purged of so much of what made them unique individuals. But unlike the Silent King, most of the Necrons at first cared not at all for their loss. All that mattered to them was that they would live forever, without disease or death, as their star gods had promised. Renewed and empowered as never before by their devouring of souls of an entire species, the Catan were now unstoppable, and with the undying legions of Necrons marching in their wake, the Old Ones were doomed. Only one thing remained of the old Necrontyr: their burning hatred for all other living, intelligent species of the universe. Legions of the undying living metal warriors set out into the galaxy in their tomb ships, and the stars burned in their wake. The Old One's mastery of the warp was now countered by the Catan's supremacy over the physical universe, and the ancient enemies of the Necrons suffered greatly in the interstellar slaughter that followed. With the Catan and the Necrons fighting as one, the Old Ones were now doomed to defeat. Glutted on the life force of the Necrontyr, the empowered Catan were able to unleash forces beyond comprehension. Planets were razed, suns extinguished, and whole star systems devoured by black holes called into being by the reality-warping powers of the star gods. Necron legions finally breached the webway and assailed the Old Ones in every corner of the galaxy. They brought into siege the fortresses of the Old Ones' many allies amongst the younger intelligent species of the galaxy, harvesting the life force of the defenders to feed their voracious Catan masters. In the closing years of the War in Heaven, one of the primary factors that led to the Necrons' ascendancy was their ability to finally gain access to the Old One's webway. The Catan, known as Neadrazath, the Burning One, had long desired to carry his eldritch fires into that space beyond space, and so showed the Necrons how to breach its extra-dimensional boundaries. Through a series of living stone portals known as Dolmen Gates, the Necrons were finally able to turn the Old One's greatest weapon against them, vastly accelerating the ultimate end of the War in Heaven. The portals offered by the Dolmen Gates are neither so stable nor so controllable as the naturally occurring entrances to the webway scattered throughout the galaxy. Indeed, in some curious fashion, the webway can detect when its environs have been breached by a Dolmen Gate, and its arcane mechanisms swiftly attempt to seal off the infected spur from the rest of the labyrinth dimension until the danger to its integrity has passed. Thus, Necrons entering the webway must reach their intended destination through its shifting extra-dimensional corridors quickly, lest the network itself bring about their destruction. Of course, in the present age, eons have passed since the Necrons used the Dolmen Gates to assault their archenemies. The Old Ones are gone, and the webway itself has become a tangled and broken labyrinth. Many Dolmen Gates were lost or abandoned during the Necrons' Great Sleep, and many more were destroyed by the Eldari, the Old Ones' successors, as the guardians of the webway. Those that remain grant access to but a small portion of the immense maze that is the webway, much of that voluntarily sealed off by the Eldari to prevent further contamination. Yet the webway is immeasurably vast, and even these sundered schemes allow Necrons a mode of travel that far outpaces those of the younger races. It is well that this is so. A species bereft of psychers, as a result of their loss of their souls during the biotransference process, the Necrons are also incapable of warp travel, and without access to the webway, they would be forced to rely once more on slow voyaging stasis ships, dooming them to interstellar isolation. In the wake of their victories against the Old Ones, the Catan and their undying Necron servants now dominated the galaxy. The last planetary bastions of the Old Ones were besieged, and the intelligent species they had once nurtured became cattle for the obscene hunger of the Catan. To the younger intelligent species of the galaxy, the Necrons and their star gods were cruel masters, callously harvesting their populations at will to feed the Catan's ceaseless hunger for life. The Catan were figures of terror who demanded the mortal's adoration and fear in equal measure. For unknown reasons, but probably because their individual hungers for mortal life energies know no bounds, the Catan ultimately began to fight amongst themselves for both sport and out of spite. Among the Eldari, an ancient myth holds that their laughing god tricked the Catan, known as the Outsider, into turning on its brothers and beginning their long war for ascendancy. In the course of the Catan's struggle against one another, whole planets were razed, stars extinguished, and entire solar systems were devoured by their more unleashed black holes. New cities were built by the efforts of millions and then smashed down once more. As the red harvests of the Catan and their Necron servants grew thin, Catan eventually devoured Catan, until only a few were left in the universe, and they competed amongst themselves for a long age. Eventually, even the Old Ones, who had once been defined by their patience and unstoppable will, became desperate in the face of Necron assault. They used their great scientific skills to genetically engineer intelligent beings with an even stronger psychic link to the warp, hoping to create servants with the capability of channeling psychic power to defend themselves. They nurtured many potential warrior species, among which are believed to be the earliest members of the Eldari species, and many other Xenos races, including the Rishon, the Nib, and the Krorg. Many others included among this umbrella. Terran millennia passed as the Old One's creations and experiments finally bore fruit, even as the Catan and their Necron servants continued to extinguish life across the galaxy. Eventually the tide would turn. The Old One's physically empowered servant species spread across the galaxy, battling the advanced Necron technology with the psychic power of their warp-spawned magic. Facing this new onslaught, the Catan's empire was shattered, as the psychic forces of the Immaterium were anathema to the soulless entities whose existence was wholly contained within purely physical patterns of electromagnetic force. For all of the destruction they could unleash, they were unable to stop the Old Ones and the younger race's relentless advance across the stars. The remaining Catan, unified by this great threat for the first time in millions of Terran years, sought a way to defeat the soul-fueled energies of the younger species. They initiated Great Warding, a plan to forever defeat the psychic sorceries of the Old Ones by sealing off the material universe from the warp. A plan whose fruits could be once found on the Imperial Fortress world of Cadia in the form of the great pylons that littered the surface of that intricate networks and create the area of space-time stability near the Eye of Terror known as the Cadian Gate. With their godlike powers, it was only a matter of time until the Catan succeeded, but their great work was complete. The seeds of destruction the Old Ones had planted millennia before brought an unforeseen cataclysm. The growing pains and collective psychic flaws of the younger species threw the untapped, psychically reactive energies of the Immaterium into disorder. War, pain, and destruction were mirrored in the bottomless depths of the Sea of Souls that was the warp. The maelstrom of souls unleashed into the Immaterium by the carnage of the war in heaven coalesced in the previously formless energies of the warp. Older entities that existed within the Immaterium transformed into terrifying psychic predators, tearing at the souls of vulnerable psychers as their own environment was torn apart and reforged into the realm of chaos. The denizens of the warp, stirred into a frenzy by the conflict in the Materium, clustered voraciously at the cracks between the Immaterium and material universes. Seeking new ways to enter the physical realm, the Old Ones brought forth new, genetically engineered warrior species to defend their last strongholds, including the technology-mimicking Jokero and the formidable green-skinned Krork, who were ancestors of present-day orcs, but it was already too late. The Old One's intergalactic webway network was breached from the Immaterium and lost to them. Several of their warp gates were destroyed by their own hands to prevent the entities of the warp from spreading to uncorrupted worlds, and the Old One's greatest works and places of power were overrun by the horrors of their own creations. Their hubris had unleashed true terror upon their empire, destined to crumble to dust. The most terrifying of these horrors were the enslavers, warp entities whose ability to dominate the minds of younger species and create their own portals in their material realm using mutated, possessed psychers brought them forth in ever greater numbers. For the Old Ones, this was the final disaster as the enslavers took control of their servants. The Pandora's box, unleashed by the creation of the younger species, finally scattered the last of the Old Ones and broke their power over the galaxy once and for all. Life had stood at the edge of an apocalypse during the war in heaven between the Old Ones and the Catan. Now, as the enslavers breached the Immaterium in epidemic proportions, the survivors looked doomed. Ultimately, beset by the implacable onset of the Catan and the calamitous warp, spawned perils they had themselves mistakenly unleashed, the Old Ones were defeated, scattered, and finally destroyed. Whether the species went extinct or simply fled the galaxy to seek new haven elsewhere is unknown. We'll take a short break here, so we can rest my jowls. Predator check? I can't see anything yet, so let's see. It's not quite high enough to see, I don't think. No, not quite. We'll just have to wait. Alright, we're almost through this section. I hope you guys are having fun. I'm having fun. I'm even learning lore that I had either forgotten or didn't know. I think the Necrons' history is very interesting. They have a lot of really good novels. Welcome back. Let's catch back up. Throughout the final stages of the war in heaven, Zarek bided his time, waiting for the moment in which the Catan would prove most vulnerable. Though the entire Necron species was now to his command, the Silent King could not hope to oppose the Catan at the height of their power, and even if he did, and met with success, the Necrons would have then to finish the war in heaven against the Old Ones, and their increasingly potent allied species alone. No, the Old Ones had to be completely and utterly destroyed before the Catan could be brought to account for the horror they had wrought among the Necron tier. And so, when the Catan finally won their great war, their triumph was short-lived. With one hated enemy finally defeated, the others spent from hard-fought victory. The Silent King, at last, led the Necrons in revolt. In their arrogance, the Catan did not realize their anger until it was too late. The Necrons focused the unimaginable energies of the living universe into weapons, god-killing hypercannons devised by the finest cryptechs in the galaxy. Too mighty even for the star gods to endure. Not even the great overlords of the Necron crown worlds remember well the battles against the star gods, for causality itself was damaged by the forces unleashed to dismember the Catan. The Silent King was wont to remember the knowledge of the dreadful weapons employed from his warriors after the fact, in fear of what might later be done with them. Alas, the Catan were immortal star spawn, part of the fundamental fabric of reality, and therefore nigh impossible to destroy. So was each Catan instead sundered into 1,000 smaller and less powerful energetic fragments, each with the personality of the whole entity. Yet this outcome was sufficient to the Silent King's goals. Indeed, he had known the Catan's ultimate destruction to be impossible, and had drawn his plans accordingly. Each newborn Catan shard was bound within a multi-dimensional tesseract labyrinth, as trammeled and secured as a legendary Terran djinn trapped in a bottle. Though the cost of victory was high, millions of Necrons had been destroyed as a consequence of the rebellion, including all of the members of the Triarch save the Silent King himself. And the Necrons were once more in command of their own destiny. The Necrons had been vindicated in their pursuit only of science and control over the material realm, and certainly took pleasure in seeing the Old One's civilization collapse as a result of their overindulgence of psychic power, and the end of the Catan's dominion over their species. Yet, even with the defeat of the Old Ones and Catan alike, the Silent King saw that the time of the Necrons in the galaxy was over. For the moment, at least. They would allow the enslavers to take what was left of the intelligent life in the galaxy and let it become an interstellar wasteland. The Psycho Swarm would then die away, and in time the galaxy would evolve new life forms who would be less sophisticated and easier to dominate. In addition, the Necrons understood that the mantle of galactic dominion was soon to pass to the Eldari, one of the psychically potent species that had fought alongside the Old Ones throughout the war in heaven, and had thus come to hate the Necrons and all of their works with a burning passion that is the defining characteristic of that species. The Eldari had survived, the old ones. The Eldari had survived, but the old ones had not, and the Necrons, weakened by their expenditure of lives and resources in overthrowing the rule of the Catan, could not stand against them. Yet the Silent King knew that the time of the Eldari would eventually pass, as it must pass for all those beings who still cloaked in flesh. It would take millions of Terran years for the Eldari's power to fade, but what mattered is that the Necrons would be there to take advantage of it. So it was that the Silent King ordered the remaining Necron cities to be transformed into great tomb complexes threaded with stasis crypts. Let the Eldari shape the galaxy for a time. They were but ephemeral, whilst the Necrons were undying and eternal. The Silent King's final command to his people was that they must sleep for the equivalent of 60 million standard years, but awake, ready to rebuild all that they had lost to restore the Necron dynasties to their former glory. This was the Silent King's final order, and as the last tomb world sealed its subterranean vaults, Zarek destroyed the engrammatic command protocols by which he had controlled his people for so long, for he had failed them utterly. Without a backward glance, Zarek, at the last of the Silent Kings of the Triarch, took ship into the starless void of intergalactic space, there to find whatever measure of solace or penance he could. Meanwhile, eons passed and the Necrons slept on, their machine slaves and constructs guarding them while they slept on tomb worlds that had been purged of all life to keep the enslavers from their door. His plan worked, with an amazing degree of success, until the Necrons were awakened by the forces of the Imperium of Men in the 41st millennium to plague the galaxy once more. They discovered a new and unexpected age of interstellar civilization and war, much like the one they had left behind 60 million standard years before. The galaxy is blossoming with life once more, but it is still overrun with latent psychers and worshippers of the infernal chaos warp energies first unleashed in the war in heaven. It will take time, and a great many of the machinations for the Necron dynasties to regain their rightful place as rulers of the galaxy. The agents of chaos must be overthrown, the dangerous Eldari, inheritors of the Old One's mantle, eliminated, humanity subjugated, and the great work of cutting off the material universe from the warp completed before a new age of Necron dominion can truly begin. But the Necrons are ageless and undying, their technology still unmatched by any of the younger starfaring species, and time, well, time is always on their side. In our next lore session, we will investigate and prod at the rise of humanity from the first millennia to modern day and all the way to the 41st millennium. What, did you not like it? I liked it. That was fun. I thought that was really fun. My tiny human brain. Yeah, that reading of that section took basically an hour. Like 57 minutes on the dot. I thought it was quite delightful. But, reading and talking for like an hour straight is hard on the old cheeks. You know what I mean? Hard on the vocals. You said cheeks. I sure did. I sure did say cheeks. I'm gonna say it again. Cheeks. 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 I'm gonna stand up for a sec. My ass. Well, print is still not high enough out of the vat for me to see if it's failed or not, so I guess I'm just gonna ride it out. I'm just gonna ride it out. Let it go. Let it print! I need some different curtains. I hate these red ones. It's just what I have. I want some black curtains, man. Black is my soul.